I recommend you go on the website and look at the diagram for the course, because in the course we're going to go roughly clockwise around the diagram from 8 o'clock to 5 o'clock, and that's roughly my agenda for today, is hitting the high points of that. So I think Sellars is the greatest American philosopher since Peirce, and that his philosophical ideas are, if anything, even more important than Peirce's, just insofar as Sellars isn't as dead as Peirce is, and the issues that he was addressing are in much closer contact to the issues that we care about today. But also, methodologically, Sellars was that rara avis, a systematic analytic philosopher. Systematists come back. David Lewis, in his way, Davidson was systematic, but the form that analytic philosophy focused on was the gem-like essay. And Sellars aimed at the synoptic vision. He wanted to know how things in the largest sense of the term hang together in the largest sense of the term. And that was very unusual. It's still unusual. Second, he was a historical philosopher. He thought of the history of philosophy as the language in which we do philosophy. He said, philosophy without the history of philosophy is, if not blind, at least dumb. It doesn't have a language to speak. And I'll be pitching Sellars here as the greatest interpreter of Kant of his time. That's sort of at the center of the historical universe from his point of view. But before I get to that, it's worth saying that I regard Sellars as also one of the two most important pragmatists of his generation, the other being Quine. The best current scholarship on American pragmatism, and by that I mean Cheryl Mesack, has taught us to think of the American pragmatists as having two wings. There's a lineage that goes from Peirce to C.I. Lewis to Sellars and Quine, and it's largely independent of the line of affiliation that goes from James to Dewey to Rorty. I would put myself strongly on the Sellarsian side of that, even though Rorty was my Dr. Vater and sort of brought me to the pragmatist party. Both Sellars and Quine were actual students of C.I. Lewis, who himself took his main job to be synthesizing his teachers, William James and Josiah Royce, but also, and non-trivially, bringing Kant to American Anglophone philosophy. He was a avowed NeoKantian. Both Quine and Sellars also, though they were not taught by him, extravagantly admired Rudolf Carnap and were, if anything, even more influenced by him than by their actual teacher, C.I. Lewis. And each of them responded to Lewis and to Carnap by pragmatist critiques of inherited philosophy. The locus classicus for an account of that is chapter 4 of Rorty's masterpiece, Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature. And I'll talk about the sense in which Sellars' critique, pragmatist critique, and Quine's pragmatist critique are two sides of one coin, complementary things. But I'm not going to talk about that today. But I will say that the contrasts between Sellars and Quine as philosophers and as people could not be stronger and sharper than it is. At the institutional end, Quine was recognized hugely influential philosopher at Harvard from the time he was in his mid-20s, and just stayed at Harvard, had basically everybody as his students during the time of his flourishing in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Sellars, sort of, though he was always recognized as important, never had anything like the influence that Quine did. He was a failed philosophical writer. One of the things he failed to write was a dissertation. He failed to write a Ph.D. at Oxford. He failed to write a Ph.D. at Harvard. And he finally failed to write a Ph.D. at Buffalo, where he got his M.A. Never had the sort of students that Quine did. In personality, one of the sages of our time, Liam Kofi Bright, has divided philosophical personalities into basically pleasant bureaucrats and sexy murder poets. And I think Quine and Sellars are paradigms of these two sorts of characters. I'll say more about the Sellars side of that later on. So our aim reading Sellars, I think, should be, as Hegel thought our aim always should be, to understand a philosopher better than he understands himself. And I think we're actually in a position to do that. Maybe a first move in that enterprise was taken a couple of decades ago by Rorty, one of Sellars' great champions and admirers. And he introduced the idea of right-wing and left-wing Sellarsians. And he did so by looking at two index passages from Sellars' masterwork, Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind. If you're looking at the Sellars quotes that I made available on the website, the first of them is from section 36. In characterizing an episode as one of knowing, we're not giving an empirical description of that episode or state. We're placing it in a logical space of reasons, of justifying and being able to justify what one says. So he's saying there's something to do other than empirical description. And when you place something in the space of reasons, you're doing that other thing. Or anyway, doing one of the other things. Second, a passage that's come to be called the Scientia Mensura from section 41. In the dimension of describing and explaining the world, science is the measure of all things, of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not. Now, I think when, and Rorty's division was, the people who think that Sellars' deepest insight was that space of reason's non-naturalism are what he called left-wing Sellarsians. And that included him, certainly it includes me. Those who take the Scientia Mensura passage as expressing Sellars' deepest insight, he called right-wing Sellarsians. And that includes very good people like Ruth Millikan, Paul Churchland, Jay Rosenberg, among others. And I think if contemporary philosophers read these two passages side by side, there's automatically more sympathy for the Scientia Mensura. That sort of scientific naturalism is abroad in the land. It's a familiar sort of view. One takes it that one sort of knows what he means by that passage, even though you might suspect that there's depths hidden in the actual wording of that slogan, and you'd be right. There are subtleties in it. Still, that's a familiar view, that sort of scientific naturalism. The space of reasons passage, that non-naturalism, would say, you're doing something other than describing something when you call it knowledge, and he's willing to say exactly the same thing about belief. It's not that it's sort of the good kind, the knowledge that's so important. In attributing a propositional attitude like that, you're not describing somebody when you say what they believe. So what are you doing? Well, we're going to look at both of these things. Rorty famously expressed the hope that the right-wing and left-wing Sellarsians would be able to sort out their differences more ironically than the right-wing and left-wing Hegelians did at a 6-month-long seminar called the Battle of Stalingrad, when the Nazis and the Marxists, the right-wing Hegelians and the left-wing Hegelians, sorted their differences out. And so far I can report, we don't seem to be headed towards a Battle of Stalingrad situation. I introduce this way of thinking about Sellars both because I think there's a lot to it, even though the current generation of younger Sellars scholars have been trying to work beyond this gross setting out. And they start with the appreciation that Sellars knew perfectly well that these two thoughts ran in different directions, were in a certain kind of tension with each other. And his main metaphysical undertaking was to try and get them into one synoptic vision, to reconcile them, to say how both of these could be fundamental insights. So that even those of us who have less sympathy for the scientific naturalism ought to appreciate what's right about it, and the sort of rarer case where people either just don't know what he could be on about in talking about the space of reasons, placing things in the space of reasons, the domain of justifying what one is saying. Still, they need to learn that. They need to learn that lesson. That is one of his insights. But if we try and move beyond that Rortian framing of Sellars' synoptic vision as riven into a left wing and a right wing, and if you're looking at that diagram that I recommended, that's the left and the right side of that triangle. That's 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock there that he's trying to get together. I think the next step forward in getting our arms around the Sellarsian system is to take him at his word. When late in life he was asked by one of his students what he hoped the ultimate effect of his philosophical work would be. And he said that he would count himself successful insofar as he helped usher analytic philosophy from its Humean phase to its Kantian phase. And I think indeed that is of the essence of what he was trying to do. My doctor fought her Rorty when he wrote the introduction to our edition of Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, characterized what I was trying to do as moving analytic philosophy from its incipient Kantian phase to its eventual Hegelian phase. But I'm really not going to talk about that during this semester. The Kantian antecedents are quite sufficient for us to wrestle with here. So I want to suggest, as the sort of next drilling down after the right wing and left wing, that we think of Sellars' system as organized by three great Kantian lessons, three big ideas he saw Kant as having that he revived and developed in our own time. And I think the way he picked up these Kantian themes is one of the permanently valuable contributions that he made. Basically, one of them corresponds to the left-wing side, one of them corresponds to the right-wing side, and one of them now to the top of the diagram that we have there. Just for slogans to go with them, the first big idea is the normativity of intentionality. And the second one is Kant's idea of the categories. And the third one is Kant's transcendental idealism. The part of Kant's theoretical philosophy that is least loved by contemporary Kantians. Strawson, who did more than anybody to revive interest in Kant's theoretical philosophy, said, yeah, but you got to throw away that transcendental idealism stuff. John McDowell, in his appreciative effort to revive Kant in Mind and World, says, yeah, but the transcendental idealism, that's got to go. Sellars says, no, that's one of the real insights that he had. Transcendental idealism, what he makes of transcendental idealism is the key to his reconciliation of normative non-naturalism, of the space of reasons, and scientific naturalism. So these three big Kantian ideas, the normativity of intentionality, the idea of the categories, and an astonishing version of transcendental idealism. So let me talk about the first of those Kantian big ideas. Kant is, for Sellars and for those of us who learned to think about these things and to see these lessons in Kant from Sellars, Kant is, for contemporary philosophers, what the poet Swinburne said the sea was, the great gray mother of us all. All the streams come down to us from Kant. And I think, having learned this lesson from Sellars, that the axial thought in Kant, the one around which everything else turns, is his insight into the normative character of discursiveness. Kant's idea was that what distinguishes us as knowers and agents from everything else, from the stuff that's out there and from less capable critters, what distinguishes us as knowers and agents is that claims we make, beliefs we have, and things we do intentionally are things that we're, in a unique sense, responsible for. That believing something is a kind of commitment. It's an exercise of a kind of authority that involves a distinctive kind of responsibility. We're rational creatures because we can commit ourselves in a way that makes us responsible for having reasons justifying those commitments, entitling us to those commitments. Now, talk about responsibility, authority, commitment, entitlement. These are all normative notions. Kant saw us as creatures who had the authority to make ourselves responsible, theoretically, for how things, commit ourselves to how things are, and practically to commit ourselves to how things shall be. He saw the distinction, what divides us from other things, not as a distinction of two kinds of substance, mind and body, thinking substance and extended substance, but as a distinction between a normative realm in which we live and move and have our being, a realm of commitments, of responsibilities on the one hand, and a non-normative factual realm on the other. He replaced the distinction between minds and bodies with the distinction between norms and facts. And that made all things new. I mean, part of what it makes new is what the job of philosophers is to understand normativity. But it had immediate consequences for Kant, thinking of things this way. It had as a consequence, for instance, that the minimal unit of experience or cognition for him becomes the judgment, because that's the smallest unit you can commit yourself to, that you can take responsibility for. What's expressed by singular terms and predicates, the singular and general concepts of the tradition that he'd inherited, for instance, in the Port Royal logic, but in traditional logic, those were the units that the tradition started with, concepts. But Kant says, no, the minimal unit is the minimal unit you can make yourself responsible for, and we have to understand concepts as functions of judgment, as things that can yield judgments. We have to understand them in terms of the functional role they play in judgments. This thought, by the way, is picked up by Frege, who endorses this Kantian primacy of the propositional by seeing declarative sentences as the smallest unit to which pragmatic force can attach, paradigmatically assertional force. And so he too, one of the founding ideas of modern logic was to understand what's expressed by predicates in terms of the function it plays in sentences. Without that, he couldn't have figured out how to generate the semantic roles of iterated quantificational sentences from the roles of simpler sentences. You needed to reconceive concepts in order to do that. We can see the heritage of this idea in the later Wittgenstein, again focusing on sentences as the smallest unit with which you can make a move in a language game. and trying to understand everything else in terms of those moves that you make in the language game by making a claim using a singular term. In Kant, one of the consequences of this normative turn that he takes is that whereas the whole tradition he inherited had thought about concepts and ideas in terms of our grip on them, is it clear? Is it distinct? Do we have an adequate idea? But for Kant, thinking of concepts as rules for making judgment, the question is how to understand the norm, the rule that is the concept, how to understand its grip on us. How is it that we can become subject to a rule? The rule, for instance, that's curled up inside the concept of copper. But he sees that as of a piece with how we can be gripped by, how we're to understand the grip of a practical norm on us as well. Those are two sides of one coin for Kant. That's a transformative view. And we can immediately see some of the index features of Kant's view of judgments if we look at it through this normative lens. He says judgments have a subjective form and an objective form. The subjective form is the I think, which can accompany all of our judgments, and so is the emptiest representation of all. Well, that's the mark of who's responsible, who takes responsibility for the commitment. And that leads him to the idea of the transcendental unity of apperception, the kind of unity that all your commitments have. The objective form of a judgment is the object equals X, he says. What you're talking about when you make a judgment, what you're representing by it. Well, in Kant's understanding, that representational relation, that talking or thinking about something, the object equals X, that your judgment is about, that's a normative notion. That's what you're making yourself responsible to when you make the judgment. What supplies the standard for assessments of the correctness of your commitment in a distinctive representational sense of correctness. He reconceives the relation between a representing and a represented in terms of the authority that the representing has over the represented, over the representing, the way in which our representings, our judgments, are responsible to what they're about. In the normative sense that what they're about, the object equals X, supplies the normative standard for assessments of the correctness of the judgment as a representing of that represented. Well, obviously this opens up into a big story about Kant, and I'm telling you this story the way I think about it, not specifically the way Sellars thinks about it. But if you look again at some of these passages, already in 1949, in his essay, Language, Rules, and Behavior, Sellars says, to say that man is a rational animal is to say that man is a creature not of habits, but of rules. When God created Adam, he whispered in his ear, in all contexts of action, you will recognize rules, if only the rule to grope for rules to recognize. When you cease to recognize rules, you will walk on 4 feet. Again, a rule, properly speaking, isn't a rule unless it lives in behavior. Rule-regulated behavior, even rule-violating behavior, Linguistically, we always operate within a framework of living rules. To talk about rules is to move outside the talked about rules into another framework of living rules. The snake which sheds its skin lives within another. In attempting to grasp rules as rules from without, we're trying to have our cake and eat it too. To describe rules is to describe only the skeletons of rules. A rule is lived, not described. Now you might begin to see the relevance of these claims to the claim that in calling something a belief or a bit of knowledge, one isn't describing it. One's doing something else. Again, another passage that's on that list of passages I extracted. When we characterized language as a system of norms, we didn't stress what I now want to, namely that a norm is always a norm for doing. A rule is always concerned with doing. Knowing a language is knowing how. It's like knowing how to dance or how to play bridge. Again, the meaning of a linguistic symbol as a linguistic symbol is entirely constituted by the rules which regulate its use. So he's writing this in 1949. Wittgenstein's investigations won't come out for 4 years yet. He says, to talk about rules is to use a pragmatic meta-language. Pragmatic meta-language as opposed to a semantic meta-language, a language that you use to talk about the use rather than the meaning of an expression. A pragmatic meta-language includes a semantic meta-language as a proper part, just as a semantic meta-language includes a syntactical meta-language as a proper part. Those are Carnapian references there. Again, it's only if there's a pragmatics, a theory of use, which is a theory of rules, that is not an empirical science of sign behavior. A pragmatics which is a branch of the formal theory of language, that the term is rescued for philosophy, and that the analytic philosopher can hope to give a non-psychologistic account of the key concepts of traditional epistemology. Philosophical propositions are propositions in the pure theory of languages, the pure syntax of pragmatic meta-languages, which are going to be the language we use to talk about what he calls rules. What I want to talk about is norms. So there's an insight here that Kant had. And Sellars saw himself as having the task of bringing that lesson to analytic philosophy. That's, in the first instance, what it would be to move analytic philosophy from its Humean empiricist phase that he was seeing Carnap as the avatar of the logical empiricist, but in this regard, Quine counts every bit as much, to bring this Kantian insight about the normativity of intentionality front and center, to integrate it with the rest. Once one's been given this clue to think about the normativity, you see it in the later Wittgenstein. Well, not just in his discussion of rules, but in his discussion of intentional states. Now, norm is not a Wittgensteinian term. He talks about rules, but he also talks about normativity where he doesn't talk about rules. To pick one passage that otherwise might be puzzling, Wittgenstein imagines that you're visiting at someone else's house, and the woman of the house says, look, I have an errand to run. Would you teach the children a game? And when she comes back half an hour later, you've taught them to roll dice, play craps for money. And she says, I didn't mean that kind of a game. And Wittgenstein says, and what she says is absolutely true, she didn't mean that kind of a game. But what kind of fact is that she didn't? It's not as though she consciously rehearsed a thought as a sort of mental reservation when she said teach them a game, but not a gambling game. It didn't occur to her that he would teach a gambling game. But Wittgenstein says somehow her request reached out to all the possible things you could do, and some of them were appropriate according to it, and others were not. Normatively, some of them counted as fulfilling the request, and others didn't, given what she meant or the meaning of the request. But Wittgenstein says, how is that? How are we to understand that what she said, her request, and the state of hers that it expressed, how did it have that normative significance? How did it serve as a standard of correctness that could reach out to things that she had not consciously anticipated and rule some of them out and rule some of them in? Now, Wittgenstein spends, I think, more of his effort than he should have in diagnosing why it's hard for us to understand that. What is it that makes that puzzling to us? And I think he spends relatively less time than he ought, or anyway usefully could, in telling us how to think about it. I said, well, think about it this way and you won't have this problem. Now, Wittgenstein didn't learn all this from Kant, at least not directly. It was rediscovered as problematic by him. But this is where Sellars started, is with this Kantian idea. And, well, I said I wasn't going to talk about Hegel, but the idea that social practices and norms implicit in social practices is where you should look. That was Sellars' idea, too. And he did think of that as a Hegelian revision of or development of the Kantian thought. Now here, I'd like to make what may seem like a detour or a historical diversion, but I think is not. I will claim it's illuminating. I want to say a little something about 19th century NeoKantianism. And if you have access to the website, there's a diagram there, just because I don't take it that all these figures, this is what I'm talking about, I don't take it that all these figures are sort of well known to people. This is a minor philosophical tradition, even in Germany. Though the names would be known, nobody cares very much about them. But the start of it was in 1860 when Kuno Fischer, who was a great biographer and interpreter of Kant, the one who taught us to read Kant as, above all, a philosopher of science. His contemporary analog is Michael Friedman, whose Kant book has the theme that Kant was the greatest philosopher of science, but you should remember that the science he was the greatest philosopher of was 18th century science. And that can make his lessons hard to bring to make contemporary use of. And Kuno Fischer was responding to a professional crisis in philosophy, which was that after Hegel's death in 1830, his style of philosophy went completely out of fashion. People didn't understand it, I want to say, but it was understood as a kind of dogmatic metaphysics, and nobody had room for that anymore. That was clearly not something they could see a way forward for. But at the same time, in the first half of the 19th century in Germany, basically modern institutionalized science was coming to be in the laboratories, in the universities. The conceptual transformation that led from doing anatomy to doing physiology, from studying structures to studying functions, was paying off in tremendous ways, not just in biology, but in psychology, particularly psychology of perception, and all sorts of things that the philosophers had taken on themselves to address were now clearly much better addressed in these scientific terms. And the question was, well, what is there for philosophers to do anymore? Why do we need them? We can't do the Hegelian dogmatic metaphysical nonsense, and the methods of empirical natural science are paying off right, left, and center. Why shouldn't we just do that? What is there that the philosophers can do? And Fisher says, well, we can do epistemology. Kant had distinguished between the question of justification and the question of fact, the quid iuri and the quid facti. Quid iuris and the quid facti had criticized the philosopher he called the celebrated Mr. Locke for having given us a mere physiology of the understanding instead of an epistemology, by which he meant tracing the causal antecedents of knowledge, rather than addressing the question of the justification for the beliefs that we had. And when Fisher said in the clarion cry that gave rise to the NeoKantian movement, zurück nach Kant, go back to Kant, he said, it was this normative distinction, this notion of justification. He said, that's what philosophers should be doing, is thinking about the justification of the claims inter alia that we make in the natural sciences, but also the claims of religion or of any secular practical philosophy. And carved out space for philosophers to continue to have their professorships and write their books. The two main schools, the Baden Southwest NeoKantians, Windelband in the older generation, and then Rickert after him, and the Marburg NeoKantians, Hermann Cohen in the older generation, and Paul Natorp in the younger one. Mostly the Marburg NeoKantians looked at natural sciences, and the Southwestern Baden NeoKantians looked at social science, art, and so on. Both Carnap and Heidegger come out of this NeoKantian background. Carnap from Rickert through his student Bauch, who was a colleague of Frege, and Heidegger's Dr. Vater was Rickert, the NeoKantian. I picked Carnap and Heidegger because they had this famous dispute over das Nichts nichtet, Heidegger's the nothing noths statement. And it was two wings of NeoKantians, or anyway, NeoKantian opinions, who did. Now, it's normally thought that NeoKantianism died out. Basically, that Ernst Cassirer was the last of the NeoKantians. But I think this is not true at all. Maybe of German NeoKantianism, but certainly not in America. Carnap was a NeoKantian, though he thought of himself as an empiricist. One of Sellars' insights, he saw better than Carnap could see how Kantian Carnap's view was. I'll talk about that in just a minute. But C.I. Lewis was self-consciously a NeoKantian. And for at least 75 years, most people in American philosophy departments who took courses in Kant took the course that C.I. Lewis had taught everyone at Harvard. Just read the first critique, just read the analytic, you only get about halfway through it. That was C.I. Lewis's course. But Sellars certainly is a NeoKantian. Now, philosophically, what withered NeoKantianism? It was that taking on board this distinction between norms and facts, leave the facts, the empirical facts, facts about the material world to the scientists, to the natural scientists, let us worry about the norms, including the norms that govern the development of scientific knowledge, the norms that govern the activity of those scientists. Yeah, but where do we find those norms in the world of the natural sciences? A distinction becomes a dualism when you draw the distinction in terms that make the relations between the distinguished items unintelligible. So you can distinguish the mental and the physical, but if that distinction involves the impossibility of the mental causally interacting with the physical, then you've made perception and agency unintelligible. Your distinction has become a Cartesian dualism. Well, Kant replaces the distinction between mind and body with the distinction between norm and fact, or norm and cause. Under the NeoKantians, they could not keep it from turning into a dualism. They could not bring back together the things that they had distinguished in a satisfying way. That problem they couldn't solve. And if you were going to take this overarching idea of Kant seriously, you had to have something to say about that. Sellars took that as his life work, as to say something about that, to say how knowing what we know, well, at mid-century, in the 20th century, what should we say about that? And his answer is, there's a version of transcendental idealism, which isn't an idealism in his version. There's a version of scientific realism in which it is a kind of transcendental idealism. And that overarching metaphysical issue is the one that I most want to explore in the seminar. Roughly the second half of the seminar is aiming at that, at least to see what Sellars gives us to work with there. Now, I'm on my way from the first big Kantian idea, the idea behind the left-wing Sellarsian, behind the space of reason's non-naturalism to the one at the top. I gestured a little bit at the third idea, the transcendental idealism, and I will talk more about that at the end. Over on the left-hand side, there's two more points that I'm going to make briefly but pass over pretty quickly because that's where we're plunging in next week. And that is, Sellars said in an autobiographical sketch that already in his Oxford days, he'd had the idea that the way to understand concepts was to think about their role in reasoning rather than to think about their supposed origin in experience. So the empiricist's idea was trace back your concepts, your ideas, to the experiences that led to them, or that you would invoke to justify them. Anyway, look at their connections to experience in order to understand them. And Sellars said he'd already had the idea and took this to be a Kantian idea that we should look to their role in reasoning. So, he says, for instance, Kant was on the right track when he insisted that concepts are essentially, and not accidentally, items which can occur in judgments. And so, judgments, and therefore indirectly concepts, are essentially, and not accidentally, items which can occur in reasonings or arguments. So he takes this also to be a Kantian thought. I don't know, for those of you who are keeping score at home in Kant, the idea is that since Kant couldn't understand judgments in terms of the way they were built up out of different kinds of concepts, singular and general, he had to understand them in terms of what it was to take responsibility for or commit yourself to. Well, what are you responsible for when you make a claim? Well, having reasons for it. It's being a reasonable claim. That's why normativity and rationality are deeply identical in Kant. Well, specifically what? Well, when you make a claim, you're responsible for integrating it into a whole constellation of commitments that you have. Something that has this unity distinctive of apperception, awareness in the sense of sapience. That's a rational unity where some of those commitments serve as reasons for others. So you're responsible for having reasons in that constellation for other commitments and for extracting and acknowledging the consequences of the commitments, what follows rationally from the commitments you've undertaken, and a critical rational task responsibility to extrude incompatible commitments, to think critically, well, are these two commitments I've got compatible? If not, what do I do about it? We're to understand the responsibility that you're undertaking when you make a judgment in terms of what you need to do to integrate it into something that has the distinctive synthetic unity of apperception. It's synthetic because you have to make these things hang together. You have to synthesize them. So Sellars has the idea of thinking about conceptual content in terms of the inferences that sentences are involved in. The important thing about a concept is the role it plays as contributing to sentences functioning as premises and conclusions of inferences. think of meaning in terms of inference rather than reference or representation. That's the idea. I say, big deal there. Written a lot about inferentialism, trying to take that ball and run with it from Sellars. We'll read Inference and Meaning and the other things for next week, so I'm not going to say more about that right now. The third idea, normativity, inference, is a kind of social functionalism. Sellars is writing before the heyday of functionalism in the philosophy of mind in the late 60s. Never mind before the more contemporary incarnations of it in David Lewis's ramification plus best realizers version of it. Sellars has to make all this stuff up himself, and he has some ideas that we could usefully use. He did it in an interesting way, though I will also argue that particularly that Lewisian version can be used to help Sellars out. But one crucial thing that he saw, and this regard belongs in a box with the later Wittgenstein, is that the functional unit that you should look at in order to understand sentences and then indirectly concepts in terms of the functional role they play in that system is a whole set of social discursive practices. It's not a system that's between anybody's ears, which was the way Putnamian Turing machine functionalism originally was developed. So a social function, a social functionalism, meaning as functional classification, but the functional system is a whole system of discursive practices. Now again, locus classicus for that is his essay, Some Reflections on Language Games. That's the other one we're reading for next week, so I'm not going to say more about that. I will say, if you look at the first 3 chapters of my big philosophy of language book, Making It Explicit, the first one's about normativity, the second one's about thinking about meaning in terms of inference, and the third one's a social functionalism, scorekeeping. That is, that book is just my trying to work out things that I learned from Sellars. I think there's a lot of juice yet to be squeezed out of these thoughts. Let me mention a semi-mechanical thing here. If you look at the website and some Sellarsian resources under week 1, we'll be using those resources in other weeks too. The very first one is the bibliography. Sellars only really wrote one book, the one we'll be reading in the second chapters of in the second half, his Locke lectures, his Oxford Locke lectures, Science and Metaphysics. But he wrote something like 150 papers. There is a canonical way of referring to those in a way that I don't know any other analog of. Everybody who writes about Sellars refers to them by the first letters of the words in the title. So Language Rules and Behavior is LRB, Some Reflections on Language Games is SRLG. This is just lingua franca to keep track of this. And that bibliography lets you look up sort of in either direction and see what it is when somebody puts a string of these things together. What essays are they? And mostly in that website, if you click on the article, you'll get a version of it. I've also put PDFs of the 2 big collections of his things, the Pure Possible Worlds and Pure Pragmatics and Possible Worlds collection of his early stuff, which includes LRB and SRLG and IM MFC, meaning it's functional classification. So I may not be able to stop myself from using these abbreviations, but that's where you can go to look and find it. Also, his collection, Science, Perception, and Reality, which was where EPM, mostly that's where people saw it come out in Minnesota Studies before that. Anyway, so get comfortable using that. Also, there is a link to the Sellars archive over at Hillman. There's almost always a version of any of his essays in the archive there. Often there's many of them, and every once in a while I'll send you there. Okay, let me introduce the top of the diagram here. What's labeled is pragmatic metalinguistic expressivism, and arguing for the importance of this was really the main point of my Sellars book, From Empiricism to Expressivism, that I'll be pointing you at various chapters of along the way. This was sort of my contribution 10 years ago now to recasting the way we think about the shape of Sellars' system. What I'm presenting this term is a move beyond that, but I still think that was right as far as it goes. This is a part of Sellars' work that is completely absent from the right-wing, left-wing way of thinking about it. And actually, as far as I know, nobody who took Sellars seriously ever took this stuff seriously. They just could not see how it fit in to the other stuff Sellars was doing, and in particular the stuff they liked that Sellars was doing. And this was a shame for many reasons, but one of the reasons is that his treatment of abstract objects, which can be the center of this, is absolutely the best worked out part of his system. This is the one part that he really figured out exactly what he wanted to say, laid it out with crystal clarity. I'm not saying it's not difficult, but it is clear. And he never felt the need to go back and revise this. He just appealed to the stuff he had done here. But I was certainly one of those who just could not see why he cared about this and how it had anything to do with the rest of his work. And I think I figured it out and understand what he's doing much better. As I say, this was the impetus for writing that book. So let me introduce this idea. And it starts with the second big idea of Kant. First one, normativity, the normative turn. And this is the idea of the categories, the pure concepts of the understanding in Kant, which are concepts that he alarmingly says you grasp a priori. They're not something you understand because you have empirical knowledge. They're presupposed. Well, what is that? What is the idea? The way I'd put it is, Kant had the idea that in addition to empirical concepts, the concepts we use to describe and explain the antics of middle-sized bits of dry goods, the concepts that articulate our empirical experience of the world, the descriptions we give of it, and the explanations that we give of it. In addition to those concepts, there's another kind of concept with a different kind of expressive job. Its job is not to say how things are. Its job is to make explicit mandatory features of the framework that makes describing and explaining empirical goings-on possible. Those framework explicating concepts he called categories. And the sense in which they're a priori is not that you sort of start with them as a tabula rasa. It's that insofar as you can deploy any empirical concepts at all, any descriptions or explanations, you already know how to do everything you need to know how to do in order to grasp these framework explicating concepts. Because you're already moving in the framework of empirical concepts, you're already applying those concepts, and all the categorical concepts do is make explicit what you already know how to do, have to already know how to do, in order to have empirical experience. Now, another thing you could mean by wanting to bring analytic philosophy from its empiricist Humean phase into a Kantian phase, in addition to bringing this normative insight on board, is to bring this idea of categories in, to ask about the status of concepts whose distinctive expressive role is to make explicit necessary features of the framework within which alone it's possible to describe and explain empirical goings-on. The paradigm of those categorical concepts for Kant is alethic modal concepts. Lawfulness or law-likeness, the necessary connections. Indeed, this was the occasion of Hume's wakening Kant from his dogmatic slumbers, as Kant famously said, confessing to being woke, I guess. It was that he saw that Hume was right to see that claims about how things must necessarily be are, by law, not just that A's are regularly B's, but that all A's have to be B's. It's necessary that if it's an A, it's a B, that claims like that go beyond the content of the claim that something is an A or something is a B on the theoretical side, and that the claim that someone ought to do something goes beyond the claim that they did do it on the practical side. That on the practical side, normative claims, on the theoretical side, what's expressed by alethic modal vocabulary, paradigmatically subjunctively robust conditionals, but we can talk about necessity and possibility as a shorthand for that. Kant saw that Hume was right, that those claims have a different status and go beyond the content of claims that describe how things are. But he also saw what Hume didn't see, that you couldn't really be in the Humean predicament. The predicament that Hume thinks he's in, where he understands perfectly well what it is to say that the cat's on the mat or the frog is on the log, but doesn't understand at all what you would say if you said that if the cat were struck by lightning, it would necessarily die. No. Well, now this is the way Sellars is going to put the point. The content of descriptive concepts essentially depends on their subjunctively robust relations to other empirical concepts. What's made explicit by those subjunctives is an essential part of the framework of description. The framework of description and the framework of explanation advance hand in hand, Sellars will say. Yeah. So he says, it's only because these are on the list of quotes there. It's only because the expressions in terms of which we describe objects locate these objects in a space of implications that they describe at all rather than merely label. So, and it's an essential feature of those inferential relations, that space of implications that descriptive concepts have to stand in, that they can be appealed to in explanation and justification. That is, that you can explain the applicability of one descriptive content by appealing to the applicability of another in a subjunctively robust way. He's going to say that what's made explicit by the alethic modal is an essential part of the inferential articulation of descriptive vocabulary.
Sorry, Alice. When you say the framework explanation, is it like a linguistic framework or?
Well, the conceptual framework, but he thinks of that as, well, one of his slogans, one of Sellars' slogans is, grasp of a concept is always mastery of the use of a word. So for him to talk about concepts is to talk about the inferential articulation of linguistic expressions. So Sellars thinks that this idea of Kant's is a really important insight. And in his essay, CDCM, contrapositives, dispositions, counterfactuals, dispositions, and the causal modalities, lays out a kind of modal expressivism that talks about the difference in function between modal expressions and descriptive empirical expressions. But what I call the modal Sellars thesis is that in knowing how to use any empirical descriptive concepts or locutions, one always already knows how to do everything one needs to know how to do in order to introduce the modal vocabulary. That's the kind of a priority that Kant had, at least after it's been sanded off some of the distinctively Kantian features and made good for us today. Yeah.
So I have a question about something you cite from that paper in the text. You say, so this is from Sellars, once the tautology, the world is described by descriptive concepts, is freed from the idea that the business of all non-logical concepts is to describe, and so on and so forth. And you take Sellars here to be referring to the concepts whose role is not to describe, but which are also non-logical, are these concepts which make explicit the our conceptual framework. My question is what is meant here by non-logical, because it seems very important to Kant that the categories are logical concepts. That's what it means for them to make explicit the conceptual framework.
I mean, there's in Kant the distinction between general logic and transcendental logic is crucial,
Yes.
and these are logical in the transcendental sense. And Sellars, if you just read if you put general logic, it's the concepts that are not logical in the general logic sense. I mean, I'm going to complain about Sellars accepting the logical concepts, that's treating them as exceptions to this, treating them as non-categorical. I mean, he follows Kant in doing that, the concepts of general logic. And I think that these modal logical vocabulary is in the same box with ordinary conditionals, say. But that's revisionary, both with respect to Sellars and with respect to Kant. So Sellars is thinking with Carnap that there's the L rules, the logical rules, and then there's the P rules that articulate the meanings of ordinary empirical things. And Sellars is saying, well, and these bits of modal vocabulary are essential to the meaning of P rules, but they're not P rules themselves. They're, well, we'll see, in a meta-language that you would use to describe the use of them. That's where this meta-linguistic comes from. Yeah, Nikki?
I have a niche historical question about the anti-descriptivism, but I'm just realizing that it's break time. Did you want to do a break in the middle?
Yeah.
Shut up.
I mean, in my fantasy, I talked about abstract objects before the break, but I'm not going to do it in the next 12 minutes. So why don't we take the break now and come back at 2:30? That gives us 12 minutes. So Nikki, you had a question.
A niche historical question. I was so. This is about the anti-descriptivism and the quote that Hassan already quoted. We should free ourselves of that picture that non-logical vocabulary is there, or non-logical concepts are always in the business of describing. And you've made clear that as soon as someone like language games, Sellars is a very early adopter of investigations, which had come out 1 year prior. So he's on the game as far as late Wittgenstein is concerned. There's no Austin here, which is so strange to me, because there's this monumental philosophical event for anti-descriptivism, which is Austin's 1955 Harvard lectures, which then become How to Do Things with Words, and then there's this whole other tradition of making Austin and Wittgenstein into central figures of American philosophy, where Stanley Cavell takes that and runs with it. And are the Sellarsian strand of anti-descriptivism, or like the Sellarsian rejection of what Austin calls the descriptive fantasy, does that run completely independently of whatever Austin and the ordinary language philosophers are doing?
As far as I know, it does.
That's so cool.
And I think the reason is that Sellars in the end cared about scientific language, the language of natural science. That was what he cared about understanding. And Austin could not have cared less about scientific language, was sort of aggressively on a literary side. And, I just think different tastes. During this period, Sellars was still, reading Oxford people, mostly of the generation before that, the ones who had been his teachers or whose books he had read in the 30s when he was at Oxford. But he was still keeping up. And though he fell out with them after the catastrophe of his Locke lectures, the social catastrophe of his Locke lectures, what you're talking about is smack in the period. And I even have in my mind that on that list of attendees at the EPM lectures, I think Austin was one of them who was there. So, what did they talk about over cocktails? I don't know.
Thank you.
Okay. So look, the second idea, big Kantian idea, is this idea of categories. And I do think that there's a divide in contemporary philosophy between a minority that takes that idea seriously and thinks something could be done with the idea of categories, and the mainstream that doesn't, that is empiricist, Humean still in its phrase. So one of the things we'll look at is the treatment of alethic modality. But that wasn't, alethic modality was not the place that triggered Sellars' wakening from his dogmatic slumbers, realizing what Carnap was bringing to the party. That happened in 1947, as far as can be told. Sellars converted to what he called the new way of words, to treating philosophy of language as first philosophy in the way that the Vienna Circle had done, and that was characteristic of analytic philosophy. Sellars before that had been more old-fashioned, more like his father, Roy Wood, in thinking that the metaphysical issues were reflected in linguistic issues, but that the real issues could be discussed not so much in terms of the language that we used to talk about them. And he was reading Carnap's logical syntax of language and realized what was going on. Realized that Carnap had a version of this categorial idea. And that Carnap's version of it was that the categories are all metalinguistic concepts. In the Tarskian sense of a meta-language, in the Carnapian sense, in language, in logical syntax of language, everything is a syntactic meta-language. Later on, Carnap, under Tarski's influence, when Tarski convinced him that truth could be a respectable concept, that semantics could be done in a scientific way, added semantic meta-languages to his armamentarium. And the young Sellars, we saw some passages like this, insists that pragmatic meta-languages need to be added, and indeed that the pragmatic meta-languages, read broadly as languages for talking about the use of language, needed to be normative meta-languages. They needed to use normative vocabulary. Now, Sellars was a hugely influential convert to analytic philosophy. In the late 40s, Sellars, having failed, as I mentioned, 3 times to write a doctoral dissertation, so he and John McDowell are the only members of this faculty who do not have doctoral degrees. John, because at Oxford it was only sort of the slow kids who actually got doctorates. If you were actually good at it, they just gave you a professorship. He had his permanent position at Oxford when he was 23. This is John. But I digress. Sellars, having failed three times to write a doctoral dissertation, had gotten a position. Philosophy academia was like that in those days. But now, interrupted by the war, he'd come back, still had failed to write anything at all in basically a decade. And for them to keep him on at Minnesota, where he was, he needed to do something. And so his colleagues, mostly Feigl, his friend there, said, look, there's this burgeoning new movement. Why don't you edit collections of what people should read to do analytic philosophy? And the Sellars collections, two of them that came out in the 40s, were sort of definitive, particularly for the American version of analytic philosophy. And so Sellars was one of the best known analytic philosophers right from the beginning. Indeed, before he had ever written any philosophy, never mind analytic philosophy. But what converted him, and his early papers, first two of them, have the phrase, the new way of words, in them. That was his term for the analytic philosophy. What made the scales fall from his eyes in reading the logical syntax of language, one of those metaphysical issues that Sellars cared about because he thought that modern philosophy essentially is philosophy of science writ large. That's what distinguishes modern from earlier philosophy, is taking the phenomenon of science seriously and trying to find roughly the scientists in the world of science. And one of the things he was worried about was abstract objects. Triangularity doesn't exert any forces. Not going to find an account of it in the fundamental physicists' inventory of what stuff there is. How are we epistemologically supposed to understand our knowing anything about it if we can't tell a naturalistic story about our interactions with it? And Carnap says the statement triangularity is a property is a metalinguistic statement. It is, in the jargon of language, of the logical syntax of language, a quasi-syntactic expression. That is, it's a metalinguistic expression disguised as a ground level description. And the perspicuous form of it, what means the same thing, but not put in a quasi-syntactic, but in an explicitly metalinguistic form, is, quote, ... is triangular, is a one-place predicate. That metalinguistic expression, he says, has the same content as triangularity is a property. So if we can understand in a non-puzzling way what it is to talk about predicates, bits of language, and sort them according to the functional jobs they're doing, in this case it's a one-place predicate, that's really what's underneath saying triangularity is a property. And Sellars, at that point, saw, as he would put it, that Carnap took the Kantian notion of categories and a whole lot of other suspect metaphysical stuff and transposed it into a metalinguistic key. To say, look, the things you're puzzling about finding in the world, that's because they aren't in the world in the narrow sense in which natural science studies the world. They're only in the world in the larger sense that includes talk about talking, metalinguistic talk. And Sellars had the idea that most, maybe all puzzling philosophical issues were ultimately issues about how to talk about talking, as opposed to how to talk about the world. Of course, we're going to have to get talking into the world, and this doesn't solve all of the problems, but that was the sort of blinding insight. Now, there's big problems with this view about abstract objects. When I say triangularity is a property, I'm not talking about the word triangular or dreieckig or any other particular language. There's no reference to any particular linguistic expressions in it. So a lot of work is going to have to be done to make that Carnapian account work. We'll see sort of some of the troubles. And Sellars painstakingly goes through what the objections are and how the view can be fixed up. And in an astonishing series of, 3 essays, but one of them has 2 parts and one of them has 3 parts. It's a huge chunk of stuff that he did between 59 and 63. He introduced 3 crucial bits of technical metalinguistic machinery. Dot quotes, which basically refer to functional classifications. Dot red is a way of talking about what the word red and the word rot and the word rouge have in common. He introduced what he calls the illustrating sign design principle for individuating functional classifiers like dot-quoted expressions. And he introduced jumblies from the Lewis Carroll poem about the land of the jumblies. Jumblies, this astonishing artificial language that consists only of singular terms and yet can discuss its own, can be its own meta language and has many other virtues, and uses these systematically to give an account of abstract object talk that I think is still head and shoulders above anything that's been done since, and gives us machinery for talking about talking that is just hugely valuable. So as I say, this is the best realized of Sellars' philosophical works. So we're going to spend 2 weeks reading these things, and this is what I call Sellars' nominalization nominalism, that he says these properties, universals, are not in the empirical world. They're a misleading way of talking metalinguistically, talking about talking. But don't we need sort of property talk in order to describe things? Well, yes, we do. He says there has to be some kind of one in many that isn't a universal, that actually is in the world. But it ain't properties, it ain't universals, what is it? Well, I'm going to read you one of the quotes that summarizes this. This is 17 on the list of quotes, if you have them. He says, the problem of the one and the many, that's at least a medieval description of it, I think ancient, is in fact broader than the problem of universals. If, therefore, we can understand the relation of the lion, one, to lions, many, without construing the lion as a universal of which lions are instances, and if the looked-for singular term pertaining to pawns can be construed by analogy with the lion, indeed as the pawn in chess, then we would be in a position to understand how the pawn could be a one as against a many without being a universal of which pawns are instances. This, in turn, would enable a distinction between a generic sense of abstract entity, in which the lion and the pawn, as well as triangularity, and that 2 + 2 = 4, would be abstract entities, as being ones over manys, and a narrower sense of abstract entity in which qualities, relations, sorts, classes, propositions, and the like are abstract entities, but of these only a proper subset, universals but not propositions, for example, would be ones over and against instances or members. This subset would include the kind lion and the class of pawns, which must not be confused with the lion and the pawn as I construe them. Now, I want to say, you didn't understand that at all. You will, I promise you, when we've walked through this, indeed you'll say, well, yes, he's drawing just the distinctions that he needs to draw here. Well, I mean, he's appealing to the distinctions that he's drawn elsewhere. And I read this, even though it verges on unintelligible, because it does illustrate one virtue of Sellars' writing, which is that you can tell when you can't understand what he's saying. Happily, often you can understand what he's saying, but when you don't, you know that he's making distinctions that you're not in control of, and so don't know the connections that he's putting between these. And it's, I think, an often overlooked vice of a certain kind of clarity of philosophical prose. Hume, Davidson, a lot of McDowell, that when you read it, it just seems absolutely to be telling you how things are. It's, as it were, transparent. You can see what he's saying. And it takes a lot of work to realize you don't understand it at all. That the prose is so well constructed and plausible that all of the difficulties are out of view in it, in subtleties that you're not picking up, in presuppositions that are there. It's only after you really focus on it that you realize everything that's going on and that you don't get everything that's going on. Sellars, when he's doing that, it sounds like this. And, he's doing something, I don't know, behind the curtain, and you're only seeing the bumps from it. But that is because I picked a summary passage where all the actual action happens before, and he's just telling us how it goes here. What I'm calling the nominalization nominalism is that Sellars thinks that any expression that produces a noun from something of another part of speech is metalinguistic. So triangularity comes from triangular. It's a nominalization of an adjective. That's a singular term, and property is the sortal native to that kind of singular term. So it's a sortal noun that applies to adjective nominalizations. All of those sorts of cross-sortal nominalizations, Sellars says, are metalinguistic, and you shouldn't look for a scientific account of what they refer to, a natural scientific account. They're going to be part of pure pragmatics, an account of the use of language. He thinks that even where terms are formed from terms, if you formed a singular term from a sortal. So lion is a kind. Lion, but that's a sortal noun, a sortal term. Lionhood is a singular term formed from that sortal term. That's bad too. Or anyway, to be given quite a different kind of account. Now, why does he think that? Why is that way of introducing singular terms shift their reference from the world to, shift it anyway, mark that the reference is to be found in talk about the use of language instead of talk about the world? Well, he ends up being an ontological nominalist because of this nominalization nominalism. And this is one of the metaphysical issues that sort of led to the title of the seminar. There's 5 metaphysical issues, sort of big ones. What kind of thing are meanings? How should we think about abstract objects? What's the status of modal properties? The big overarching one, how do norms fit into the natural world? And then this last issue that comes directly out of the treatment of abstract objects. I say directly, not because it's perfectly clear how the connection goes, but just that he clearly moves from the one to the other, to ontological nominalism, which is one view in, whose metaphysical contrast class, the home language game of the ontological nominalism is when you ask, well, the world, the thing we're in and talking about, is it ultimately a world of things, each of which can be referred to by a singular term, and that's the only kind of thing there actually is in the world? That's nominalism, after the names. Or is it a world of facts? The world is everything that is the case. The Tractatus begins with, it's a world of facts, not of things, not of objects. Objects are only in it insofar as they participate in facts. If you've got facts, well, then you've got properties and relations and that stuff too. And Sellars is committed by the account that he gives of abstract objects to seeing the world that is the empirical world that science is the measure of, has complete authority of what it says, of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not. That is, what things there are. That passage does not say of what is that it is and what it is. Because what it is isn't in the world. What it is a property. And talk about properties is talk about talking about what's there. So Sellars is an ontological nominalist. And we've got to worry about what the considerations are between world of fact and world of things. The careful way to put it is world of particulars. Is it a world of particulars or a world of facts? If it's a world of facts, then there are relations and properties in it. That's sort of the difference. There's an intermediate thing. Well, it's a world of complex, it includes complex particulars. And they are, Sellars' world is a world of complex, that includes complex particulars. And they're a kind of one in many that doesn't involve things that have instances, like properties. They have subparts. Mereology is a way of thinking about a nominalistic world. And one of the things I'll be interested in exploring is the relations between Sellars' form of nominalism and Lewisian mereological nominalism, or David Lewis's ultimate view is what he calls megathology rather than mereology. As far as I know, nobody else calls it that. Everyone else calls it mereology plus plural quantifiers, because that's how he got it, Boulas's plural quantifiers, which means you get lions in there. You've not just got Leo, but you have lions also. But you have a different, the plural quantifiers are a different kind of one in many than mereological fusions, and Lewis shows you can do a whole lot with both of those. Anyway, the fifth metaphysical issue that Sellars weighs in on, he doesn't go the mereological route. Making it work late in life, he thinks requires a process ontology. But it's this progression from nominalization, nominalism, to ontological nominalism that leads him to a process ontology. This is part of Sellars. For most of my life, I could not see for dust. When Wilfred and I, when this would come up in conversation with us, I would just start giggling at him, and that infuriated him, and he's terrifying, so basically I would flee. But I was incapable of taking this really seriously. And here I am, I take it seriously. I'm not, I still think the line of thought that gets you to nominalism, the right conclusion is you've gone off the rails somewhere. But to think that is one thing, and to say, and here's where it goes off, that's what I want to sort of think through with you. I have my suspicions. Okay, we've actually only gotten to the top of the diagram, only to around 1 o'clock on this. So, let me rush through what we're spending the second half of the course on. Basically, it's we'll read chapter 2 and chapter 5 of Science and Metaphysics, where he puts this out. And this is the third Kantian idea. So, we had the normativity of intentionality, Kant's normative turn. We have the idea of the categorical concepts. And we have transcendental idealism as a way of reconciling our talk about norms with scientific practice. So one of the things you do when you are reading a philosopher to try and understand them better than themselves is obsessively rewrite everything they wrote. If and insofar as you understand what they're saying better than they do, you ought to be able to say it better. You ought to have a view about how he should have written these things. When we read his masterwork, Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, I will talk about how I would have rewritten it, combining points from the phenomenalism essay and leaving out a whole lot of what he put in there. In his most influential collection of essays, his 1963 Science, Perception, and Reality, which, as I say, I put a PDF of, so you have access to it. Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind comes in the second half of it. All of us admirers of him on the left, Wilfred, why didn't you lead with the best stuff? This is the most important thing you ever wrote. He agreed it was the most important thing he ever wrote. Why wasn't that first in there? People had to read 200 pages before they got to the good song on the album. And his view was, well, no, he thought the way he'd arranged it, which included wading through all the stuff about abstract objects, or anyway, several of the essays on it, gave a better sense of the system, of how it hung together. He starts it off with probably his second best known essay, Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man, in which he contrasts what he calls the manifest image and the scientific image. He wrote that in 61, gave the Locke lectures in 65. The book comes out in 67. In the intervening years, he stopped talking about the manifest image. In Science and Metaphysics, he talks about the common sense conceptual scheme, or the conceptual framework of common sense. And that's the one that, crucially, he says that's the framework that has persons in it. And it has norms in it, and it has making claims. That's the common sense framework. That's the manifest image. The scientific image, the still developing image of the best science, which in Science and Metaphysics he's going to look ahead to some ultimate Peircean version of it, some ideal scientific conceptual descendant of our current science that's converged in a certain way. But he contrasts these. Parenthetically, makes a very interesting distinction between two kinds of philosophy. What he calls perennial philosophy is articulating the common sense framework. Aristotle is the best practitioner of this there ever will be, of the perennial philosophy. Modern philosophy, as I mentioned before, he understands as philosophy of science. Here's this most spectacularly successful social institution of the last 350 years, the most spectacularly successful epistemological or epistemic enterprise. What do we learn about us from learning that this is the way the world is, and this is how we found out how the world is? Trying to understand that. That's the problem of modern philosophy, he thinks. And you can't have that until you have modern science. But you can continue to do perennial philosophy in the modern age, and worrying about the problem of universals, about manys and ones. Well, that's perennial philosophy, but it's going to be inflected differently in modern philosophy. The constraints are going to be different on it. So we want to distinguish the problem of universals as it shows up in perennial philosophy, as it shows up in modern philosophy. So from his point of view, the medieval nominalism, realism, and conceptualism in between them. I suppose Anselm is the conceptualist, Occam the nominalist. A whole bunch of Scotus is the big realist on this question. We can learn a whole lot from them about the way the problem of universals looks in the context of perennial philosophy, but they were innocent of the problems of modern philosophy, and our question is accordingly. We have a question they don't have as a result that they couldn't have. As I say, I think this division of two styles of philosophy, two compartments of philosophy is an interesting one. In Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man, Sellars opens the discussion. Well, so he starts off Science and Metaphysics saying, in their most general aspect, both Kant's problems and our perplexities spring from the attempt to take both man and science seriously. You're just going to have to put up with his man stuff here. Take human beings and science seriously. What science tells us about the world and the fact that people do science. How do we get that into one synoptic vision, get the doing of science into the picture that science gives us of things? That's the challenge that he sees. And already in Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, he had said, if you ask me as a philosopher, do the objects of the common sense world exist? Do persons and tables and chairs exist? I would say no, they don't. Strictly philosophically, there aren't any of those things. In Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man, he's interested in a more nuanced view. He says, well, okay, that's what you want to say in the end, but we got to say a lot more about the relations between these ontological frameworks and what's in them than that. And he begins this enterprise. Well, the conceit of Science and Metaphysics was to resolve this using the Kantian model of transcendental idealism. What does transcendental idealism say? At the roughest hand-wavy level, it says the world you move around in is empirically real, but it's transcendentally ideal. It's not the world of things as they are in themselves. It's not transcendentally real. But we can't know how things are in themselves. Maybe God could know, but we can't. We can know what's empirically real, but that's transcendentally ideal. That's hopeless caricature. Sellars wants to say the common sense world, which includes persons, includes linguistic practices and norms, and sort of all the common sense objects, that's empirically real, but it's transcendentally ideal. Strictly speaking, none of those things really exist. filling that in slightly, he says, they exist, those things exist only as the contents of the concepts we deploy when we use various words. What really exists is what natural science will ultimately tell us exists. The things in themselves are what science is ultimately authoritative about, of what is that it is and of what is not that it is not. He breaks with Kant, who says we can never know the things in themselves. He says, yeah, we've actually got a pretty good idea about how things are in themselves. Our Persian descendants will have a better idea about it. But it's not that only God could know, or that in principle human epistemic capacities can't tell us how things are in themselves, but only how they're related to us. No. Things as they're represented by the ultimate science will exist as they are represented in the concepts of that science, but they'll also exist in themselves. Whereas the things in the common sense framework, including all the norms, exist only in the contents of the representings of them. They're not ultimately the things that are represented.
Here, there's, I mean, from what I'm getting, it seems like here science means like some fundamental, alternative final science, because someone can come up to me and say, well, economics, it's a science, it says that inflation exists or something, or like, but here when Sellars is talking about science, is it like fundamental, final science, not economics or psychology or even biology, which talks about tigers?
Well, I mentioned before that when he says logic, he means general logic, formal logic, not transcendental logic. He doesn't think economics is a science. Not the way he's using the term. It's not a natural science. It's not a science of material objects. Now, it's a good question what he is going to say about prices, for instance, sorts of things that an economist might study. It's a good question what he's going to say about fancy mathematical objects, for instance. But he has a picture of natural sciences as studying material particulars, and that they're converging on the truth about what material particulars are. And he proposes to understand the relation between what there really is as represented by the ultimate science, but existing beyond those representings in being what's represented, because it's all that's really there to be represented. And the things that we've spun that exist in a sense, but that exist in these, in the contents of these representings, but not in something represented by them. Now, that's the view that he starts Science and Metaphysics with. Scientific naturalism or scientific realism as transcendental idealism is a slogan for that view. But by the end, he says, but surely there's some sense in which, in the common sense world, we're already talking about what there really is. We have our messed up cockamamie common sense concepts for doing it. But that is a way, that's the realm of appearance. So another way of thinking about the transcendental idealism is saying, oh, look, the empirical world is merely appearance. The reality is the noumena, not these phenomena, not the empirical. And that's what Sellars says. But what he aims to make good on, what he aims to entitle himself to say by the end of Science and Metaphysics, is that that common sense world, including all the norms, is not merely an appearance. It's genuinely an appearance of what there really is. And to do that, we have to make sense of the connection between those particulars that science tells us there is, that the Peircean ideal limit science will tell us there is, and the way they appear to us in our applying the concepts of the life world, of the common sense world, of the manifest image. So he turns the crank one more time on this transcendental idealism and ends up saying, well, in this sense, the sense I'm going to craft carefully for you, the objects of the common sense conceptual framework, including persons, really do exist, really are ways of talking about what there really is, even though with an inadequate set of concepts and a whole bunch of commitments that make it an appearance that's not a fully veridical appearance, but it is an appearance of these things. So he says, in the end, even as a philosopher, I can say that persons and norms and these other things really do exist. They're real, but not as conceived by common sense. That they're not. That's a not very veridical appearance of them. And the slogan for the kind of connection that he's tracing is picturing, which is chapter 5 of Science and Metaphysics. That's, I think by my count, that was the fourth of the metaphysical issues. What's the nature of meanings? How should we think about abstract objects? What's the status of modal properties? How do norms fit in the natural world? Norms and everything that goes with that, which includes persons. And then the final one is the nominalism, which obviously puts a huge constraint on your account of picturing, your account of how to connect the representings of the common sense world with what's represented by the best natural science via connecting it to the representings of the best natural science. So this is all hugely ambitious. That's the way Sellars is. He was trying to do all of this. Anyway, the second half of the course is going to be sort of focused on this wild-eyed sort of end of things. There were two last perspectives I wanted to give, given that I'm only sort of pointing at what we're going to do and what he thinks and so on, but trying to give you some flavor of it. One has to do with Sellars and Pittsburgh philosophy. A decade ago or more, when our prospective graduate students would go out and do the rounds, somebody would always say to them, "Oh, you're going to Pittsburgh next time. You know about the Pitt philosophers." They said, "Oh, what did they say about the Pitt philosophers?" And they say, "Well, when you go as a graduate student to University of Pittsburgh in philosophy, for the first year you're there, you can't understand anything they say. And after you've been studying there for a year, for the rest of your life, no one can understand anything you say." And why is that? Sellars. It's the Sellars. That's what the difference is. Now, this was never true, I assure you. But it was not as though there was no fact that was being ideologically reported that was downstream, it was upstream from all of this. And Chauncey Maher's book called The Pittsburgh School of Philosophy, about Sellars and McDowell and me, is identifying that as a way of thinking about the significance of Kant seen through the lens of Sellars that has been so significant for my work, for John's work. From the outside, I mean, of course, there was always lots more going on in Pittsburgh than that, but that was distinctive enough that was why Maher, picking up on a trope that was already abroad, talked about the Pittsburgh School of Philosophy. And I think, there really is such a thing. There is this perspective that I've given you some flavor of today. You should understand that John, my dearest friend for more than 30 years, and I disagree about almost everything in Kant and in Sellars. If you look at his essays in the volume of the New Testament that is devoted to these things, so some of these essays we'll read, that includes essays that could well have been titled "Why Bob is Wrong About Kant," "Why Bob is Wrong About Hegel," "Why Bob is Wrong About Wittgenstein," and "Why Bob is Wrong About Sellars." One of them is almost called that. The others, though, you can easily see what they are. But we're together in seeing this line of thought that is can be marked from Kant through Wittgenstein. Well, anyway, Wittgenstein is picking up this normativity issue that's at the center through Sellars and trying to make something of it. So at any rate, when you walk out of this seminar room at the end, you'll know what all that fuss is about. The last thing I wanted to say was something about Wilfrid himself. I mean, I said he belonged on the sexy murder poet side of that divide. I mean, parenthetically, those things line up with Quine being ultra-conservative politically and Sellars being a wild-eyed socialist his whole life. But Sellars was, above all, a philosopher and a metaphysician. And there was no point in his life when he really could talk to anybody about it. Feigl was his friend, and supporter when he was young. He had the philosophers of science once he came here to Pitt. But really, he chewed this stuff over himself and worked out what he thought about it and put these essays out there. He never had anybody he could talk to about it. No conversation that he could actually try these things out. he was sailing way out of sight of land as far as what other people were doing, and he was single-handing the boat out there. And it was it had to be a difficult thing. He was crusty and grumpy and hard to get along with, I think partly because of all of this. But no one makes me think so much as Sellars does of Henry James, William James' brother, the novelist, whose credo, talking about the novelists now, but this, as I said, Sellars is the one who makes me think about this. Henry James says, we do what we can. We give what we have. We work in the dark. Our doubt is our passion, and our passion is our task, and the rest is the madness of art. I think Sellars lived like that, and that if for no other reason, to get the glimpses of that interiority of a great philosopher who worked, over 40 years, worked through all of these issues, but sort of all by himself, and produced this incredible body of work. I talked to him in the last week of his life, visited him in the hospital, and said, well, I hope, you feel good about all this. I, young one that I am, feel that if I had written Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, that I would die happy. And he said, yeah, well, I think it's been taken 200 years for somebody to come along who understood what Kant was talking about. And I'm not happy that I think it's liable to be 200 years before someone comes along who understands what I'm talking about. That was the last thing he said to me. And I hope we can make that not true. That would be the best thing I could do for him, and I'd be glad if you'd accompany me. So that's what's on offer. Most of the readings are already up on the website, but check in on it because we'll add new stuff to it all along. If you're going to write a paper for the course, you need to decide along the way sort of which bits of Sellars you'd like to write about. Where on the dial are you going to point to write your source, abstract objects, norms, whatever, so that you can start paying attention to it. But we'll plunge in reading him next week. Thank you.